Today's big show is going to look at the causes of the Civil War. As a reminder, patriotism is cultural attachment to one's homeland or devotion to one's country, although interpretations of the term vary with context, geography, and political ideology. It is a set of concepts closely related to those of nationalism, which is a belief, creed, or political ideology that involves an individual identifying with or becoming attached to one's nation. I bring that up because patriotism is very involved with the causes of the Civil War. On both sides, on both North and South, on Union and Confederate, patriotism played a significant role in the Civil War taking place and lasting as long as it did. As a review, the Union Army, which would be the United States of America, there were 112,000 killed in action and 25,000 died in Confederate prison camps and 228,000 died of disease or accidents. So 365,000 total dead, 282,000 wounded. There were 2.1 million total soldiers. About 1 out of every 6 died, and about 1 out of every 3 was wounded or died when you combine those numbers. The Confederate Army, or the Confederate States of America, had about 94,000 died in action. There were 31,000 who died in Union prison camps, 140,000 died of disease or accidents, 137,000 wounded, 1,064,000 total soldiers, almost 1 out of every 4 died, and more than 1 out of every 3 was wounded or died when you combine those numbers. Higher casualty rates for the Confederate Army, even though they suffered fewer casualties. 10% of Northern males aged 20 to 45 died in the Civil War. 30% of Southern males aged 18 to 40 died in the Civil War. Now I'm going to give you 3 causes of the Civil War, but I don't want you to think of these things as 3 separate entities. They are all interrelated, very connected. States' rights, slavery, and territorial expansion. As I said, they are related and interconnected. Examining these causes will help you develop a deeper understanding of the concept of patriotism, because patriotism is at root of many of these things, and I will get to that as we go along here. States' rights is the belief that the main power is held in the individual states, not the federal government. It dates back to colonial times. The original Constitution banned slavery, but that language which banned slavery had to be removed to get Virginia to sign on to the Constitution in 1787. So our first thing we look at in states' rights would be the Tariff of Abominations and the Nullification Crisis. A tariff, as a review, a tariff is a tax on imports. So it raises the price on products or material imported from another country when purchased in the United States or whatever country issues the tariff. Imports are items bought from other countries. The Tariff of 1828 was a protective tariff. A protective tariff is designed to protect American industry. It's not concerned with raising revenue. In other words, the purpose of the tax is not to collect lots of tax. In fact, what the purpose of a protective tariff is to make it so people won't buy that product, which means the tax is very high and it makes the product very expensive. Before the Civil War, almost all industry was in the North. And this fact becomes very important. The Tariff of 1828 helped the North and significantly hurt the South. And why did it hurt the South? Because the South, being more agricultural, in particular cotton, was selling its product to countries like England, who was manufacturing it and trying to sell it to the United States. they were able to produce things more quickly, more cheaply than the United States. And frankly, many people thought the products were better made in England, for example. But that didn't help the United States industry. The problem is the tariff was really a regional thing as far as who it helped. Now, the nullification crisis is related to this. Nullification states believe that was when states believe they have the power to nullify or cancel any federal law which they feel is wrong. South Carolina declared the tariff was null and void, and they would refuse to follow it. South Carolina was saying, we're not going to participate in this. We don't care if it's a national law. We're not going to do this because the law is onerous and it hurts us. It's wrong. South Carolina began to prepare their state militia to federal enforcement of the law. They were going to call out their state militia to do battle with the United States troops if the United States tried to force them to abide by the tariff. President Andrew Jackson threatened military force to make South Carolina obey. He said he would send in the entire military to South Carolina. The second story regarding states' rights has to do with something called the Fugitive Slave Act. That act of 1850 required all escaped slaves upon capture to be returned to owners. It required all citizens in free states to cooperate with the law. This was a national law that forced free states, those states where slavery was illegal, all those northern states, including Iowa and Illinois and Indiana and Ohio and Pennsylvania and New York and the New England states. It required every citizen in those states to participate. It required all citizens in free states to cooperate with the law. Any law enforcement official who did not arrest an alleged runaway slave was fined $1,000, which would be about a $30,000 fine today. The police had to arrest a suspected runaway slave on evidence as weak as someone claiming the person was a slave. Someone comes up and says that person was a runaway slave. The police were obliged, in fact, citizens had to assist in this, just regular citizens, to arrest that person and send them back to slavery, even if they weren't a slave. Any person who caught assisting a runaway slave, helped them like on the Underground Railroad, faced a $1,000 fine, remember that's $30,000 today, and 6 months in jail. People accused of being a runaway slave could not ask for a jury trial and could not testify on their own behalf. And I'm going to linger here for just a moment. People accused of being a runaway slave. If someone pointed at you and said you were a runaway slave, and the citizens of that, and you were in Iowa, for example, the citizens had to grab you and arrest you, and when you would go before a judge, but you could not ask, if you were that person, ask for a jury trial, and you could not testify to provide evidence that you weren't a runaway slave. Officers who captured a fugitive slave received a bonus somewhere between either $10 or $5. In other words, the more people they sent to slavery or back to slavery, whether the person was a runaway or not, the more money they made. It pushed many modern people into the abolitionist camp, those people who were against slavery. But again, now this is a regional law. This benefited only the slaveholding states, and it actually created opposition in many northern states. As the tariff of 1828 was considered only helpful to one region, this was only helpful for one region. So in the class, I would have students write their thoughts on the following question: which position would have been more patriotic, supporting the fugitive slave law or actively trying to defy the fugitive slave law? It's not about which position you like better. The question is, what's more patriotic, following the law or not following this particular law? As he reviews, states' rights is the belief that the main power is held in the individual states, not the federal government. Let's turn our attention to slavery. The South in 1860 was richer than any country in Europe except England. Now, I know I told you earlier that the industry was concentrated in the North, but in the South, there was an enormous amount of wealth. However, because their economy was not diversified, they had a smaller tax base. This meant there was very little money for public schools. What this means is, in different terms, is that there were a few really, really rich people and virtually no middle class and lots of poor people. And so one thing that suffered with that is there was no public education, or very little public education. 20% of whites in the South, 20% of whites in 1860, 20% of whites in the South were illiterate, could not read or write. Only 1% of whites in New England were illiterate in 1860. Over 2/3 of whites did not own slaves in the South in 1860. And this is a really important fact. It is popular to say, for example, slavery was the cause of the Civil War. It certainly is a cause, and it is a driving force of the Civil War. It's also popular to think of the Southerners all owning slaves, but they did not. Over 2/3 of whites did not own slaves. Slaves made up 1/3 of the population of the South. Most Southerners did not own slaves, and most slaves were owned by a very small percentage of the population. In fact, 2,358 people in 1860, about 1/10% of whites, owned 100 or more slaves. And these 2,358 people were considered to be extremely wealthy. These were very, very rich people. These 2,358 individuals. And by the way, this information is publicly accessible. This is part of the 1860 census. This information is available to anyone who seeks it. This is not theoretical. We know the exact number. In fact, we know who they are. In fact, some of the people, let me show you who they are. Of the 2,358 people included William R. King, who was a senator from Alabama and owned 500 slaves. He was extremely wealthy. And in addition to a plantation owner, a huge plantation owner, cotton grower, and slave owner, he was a senator from Alabama. Jefferson Davis, also a senator, in this case from Mississippi, owned more than 100 slaves and was quite wealthy. John C. Calhoun, with whom we met earlier, a senator from South Carolina, owned more than 100 slaves. William Person Mangum, of North Carolina, senator, owned more than 100 slaves. James Henry Hammond, South Carolina senator and later governor, owned more than 100 slaves. David Yulee, a Florida senator, using his slave labor, he built the first railroad to cross the state of Florida. He was an extremely wealthy person. John Peter Richardson II, former governor and senator from South Carolina. Francis Wilkinson Pickens, former governor of South Carolina and cousin of John C. Calhoun. Thomas Watts, former governor of Alabama, owned 179 slaves. George W. Crawford, former governor of Georgia. Albert Brown, former governor of Mississippi. Joseph W. Matthews, former governor and senator from Mississippi. His plantation was over 1,000 acres in size. Many of the 2,358 people, along with being the owners of a large number of slaves and big plantations, were also politicians, holding high-ranking positions in their states. Now, my question is it important that the largest slave owners also made the laws for their states and the nation? Is that important? Does it matter? Why or why not? How did slavery benefit the North? Because it did benefit some people in the North. How did slavery benefit the South? And again, it did benefit some people. Some people in favor of slavery said they were being patriotic by supporting it, that slavery was good for the nation. Others who were against slavery said it was unpatriotic to own slaves, that it went against what America stood for. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, was slavery patriotic or unpatriotic? Now, speaking of slavery, let's talk for a second about the Dred Scott decision. This was a Supreme Court decision where the Supreme Court said that African Americans, whether slave or free, could not be U.S. citizens and had no rights. The consequences of that decision were concern over whether or not slavery would spread to the western states, cause economic panic in the North. If African Americans had no rights and slaves had no rights, and it basically would allow slavery to spread wherever. The consequences of that decision divided the Democratic Party and strengthened the new formed Republican Party greatly, of which Abraham Lincoln was a part of. Did the Dred Scott decision unify or polarize the nation? Well, I think it's clear it polarized the nation. Were the people who disagree with the Dred Scott decision patriotic? If you are against the Supreme Court decision and don't want to follow it, are you being patriotic? Or are you being unpatriotic? Abolitionism is the movement to end slavery. But let's move now to this idea of territorial expansion, which is tied to the Dred Scott decision. I hinted at it, and also related to both states' rights and slavery. The United States territory acquisitions eventually reached the Pacific Ocean. On this map that you see on the screen, the far right, the green was the territory of the original 13 colonies and went to about the Mississippi River, and then eventually became these states you see here, like Wisconsin and Michigan and Indiana and Illinois and Tennessee. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the middle section of the nation, and then the U.S.-Mexican War. Texas was annexed. After that, first Texas was annexed, and then the U.S.-Mexican War, where Mexico ceded the states of like California, Nevada, and Arizona, and Utah. And of course, the Oregon Territory, which the United States acquired by title in 1846, and then Alaska was purchased in 1867. Hawaii, which you see in the bottom left corner, will come up later, how we acquired that. Manifest destiny is a widely held belief in the 1800s that it was the obvious, manifest, destiny for the United States. Destiny means something that has to take place. It must take place. It's destiny. For the United States to control all the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. There were three themes involved in the concept of manifest destiny. American government and people were better than others. This was the belief. It was the mission of the United States to spread these democratic ideas worldwide, making everyone else more like us. And why should they not be if the United States was clearly better? And it was the destiny under God to do this work. This was the belief that people held. This set of beliefs became known as manifest destiny. And this spreading of slavery, or potential spreading of slavery westward into states before the opening up the West, there was this balance between states that practiced slavery and states that did not practice slavery. There was this balance. But after the Dred Scott decision, if slavery opened up to everything in the West, it would give an abundance of power to those in the government who favored slavery. And this was the issue that spark, for example, Abraham Lincoln's House Divided speech, where he said it was clear the United States could not exist half slave and half free. It had to be all of one way or all the other. And then it became an issue whether the United States wanted to be a slave-holding nation. So, though true that the cause of the Civil War, slavery is a significant cause of the Civil War, but there's also issue about who has more power, the individual states or the national government. And if the United States never were to grow in territory beyond, say, even the Mississippi River, this may not have been much of an issue because slavery was more important in the agricultural region of the South. And that's your big show for today.